Hey everybody, this is Professor Marks here, and I'm wanted to go ahead and come on and do a recorded segment as I've promised. And apparently, those that I've tried the last couple of times have not uploaded correctly. So I decided to try it in a different media and basically upload it from YouTube. So we'll try that and see. And next time we get together, then which should be Monday night. I'll be out of town, but I'll be able to still link up, and hopefully that session gets recorded. I don't know why the last one didn't. Um, we only had a couple of us in there the other day, anyways. But what I wanted to go ahead and go over is just kind of sum up a little bit of the stuff that we chatted about and kind of give y'all a preview of this week if you haven't already looked at it, and kind of a look into what we can expect next week. Um, the main thing that we talked about, or the main thing we started talking about, was the project. I wanted to try to answer as many questions as I could, as I know some of you have emailed with a couple of various questions, all of which were good questions. And I was looking at the rubric on your class project, and I mean, there are probably a couple of areas that I need to be more specific, and I'll go ahead and see if I can try to adjust that as I ramble. Um, what I'm really looking for here, it's not meant to be a extremely taxing project. What I'm looking at is essentially a replacement for a paper, but it's not a replacement for a long research paper. It's as it says, it's a research project. So I don't want you to read too much into it as far as that you're going to have to be visiting a bunch of archives and stuff like that. The For those who haven't gotten their topics figured out with me yet, or if you're waiting for correspondence, I think I've answered most everyone who's emailed me. But if I have a few which that are still waiting on uh, topic topics for the research project, get with me, or just look at some of our past announcements, and I should have a list of topics on there and directions on what I need to have see from you as far as topic proposals. And if you haven't already done that, please go ahead and get that to me soon, so I can know what you want to do, and you can have a warm fuzzy of that it's okay to go ahead and start, or if you've already started, that you don't have to switch directions and do a 180. My main concern there is not that uh, it, I gave you a list for a reason. All of those topics that are on that list are topics that are what I want to see for the research, but I don't want to have 10 different people researching the same thing. So that's my main goal in having y'all give me three choices and me saying yes or no on one of them. That way at least you know, or at least you know the project that you're doing, you want to do, and um, it lets me know or it lets me hear from you. So that's I won't beat that horse anymore. Just if you haven't done that, please go ahead and get that to me ASAP, and I will respond. I think all of my email issues have been sorted out. There were a couple of folks that hadn't heard from me in a minute and don't know why still, but I've done some testing, and uh, my emails seem to be going out now. So if you don't hear from me, be a pest, please, and remind me, because we are a short-term class. So the longer things lie, the farther behind we get. With that said, so as far as your project goes, once you have started kind of full sprint on your project and you're researching, what I'm looking for is it's a two-part project. It is a PowerPoint presentation and a video presentation. And video is basically, it's essentially like I'm doing now. It doesn't have to be structured like a newscast or anything like that. It's you. Essentially, it's a replacement for you presenting your findings to the class, if that makes sense. So, your video segment is doesn't have to be straight from your PowerPoint. But what I'm looking for is that your video and your PowerPoint complement each other. So your video shouldn't have information that, or it shouldn't be have information that's different from your PowerPoint, in that it can have additional, but basically that it doesn't contradict your PowerPoint, if that makes sense. So um, one is meant to complement the other. Like I said, you can use your PowerPoint to structure your video. You can record yourself presenting your PowerPoint. If you want to add some stuff, or if you found something after doing your PowerPoint, that's fine on your video, as long as it complements and or adds to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And again, if there are questions on any of this at all, please do not hesitate to contact me via Canvas, or my email, which is on the syllabus. Um, and I will try to straighten it out as best I can. Or, if there's still questions and you'd rather save them for kind of an in-person answer, then see, if you can get on Monday night, then I'll be out of town, but I'll be bringing my stuff with me. So if you can make the time on Monday night and you really want to ask a question about it, then make sure to get on Monday. We're going to be on normal time, 8 o'clock, and I will try to answer it then. I'll make sure to answer it before we leave. So that's that. But so as far as PowerPoint, if you're not used to PowerPoint, or if you're I don't want you to be nervous about PowerPoint. It's not. It can be a little daunting for for those who haven't had experience in it. But it's really, uh, I'm not looking for you to be a master of PowerPoint. The I was telling one of the folks in our meeting the other day that when I was learning how to use PowerPoint, and I was for the when I was going into the Air Force, one of the things that really helped me kind of start to navigate it was, remember on your PowerPoint slides, kind of think of it as a rule of three. You don't want really more than 3 bullet points on on each slide, and for each bullet point, you don't want really any more than 3 sentences in that bullet point. So you can. I told the folks the other day that you can do, especially if you have a couple of brief bullet points, you can do 4. But anything really more than 3 or 4 bullet points on one slide makes it a little bit busy and or makes it harder for the reader uh, to digest, if that makes sense. So PowerPoint presentations are meant to not be the most detailed in the world. They're not. They're meant to be kind of a summary, usually used in like a military briefing or a business presentation. It's not meant to cover all of a subject, but it's meant to give the viewer kind of a concise look at, this is what I'm talking about. This is what you're going to be seeing here, shortly. And that's why. So like when we do our class meetings and I'll go over a slideshow, then I'm not covering everything in the book. The bullet points are meant to kind of hit some high points and give you an idea of, this is what to expect in the book. So just remember that rule of three. So really no more than 3 bullet points, maybe 4 on a slide, and certainly no more than 3 sentences per bullet point. That gives you a nice, well-rounded slide, easy to digest, and it's also easier for you to present as well. So you're not having to constantly look back at the PowerPoint and say, okay, I've got 5 sentences on this bullet point that I've got to read, and it starts making cobwebs. So the shorter, or the more spaced out and the more concise your slideshow is, the easier it is for you to present and stay focused on it, and the easier it is for your reader or your viewer to digest. Um, if that does not make sense, please again get with me and ask. I'm also, and I'll make sure that you're clear on it before you go forward. Also on slideshows, please, yeah, if you're great with PowerPoint, then you can put in some cool transitions, text flying in and stuff like that, or you can put in animations, but please don't feel like you have to. I'm not looking for again. I'm not looking to see how advanced you are in PowerPoint. So if you again, I'm not going to penalize you if you do. If you know how to navigate through PowerPoint, and then you can make it. Don't make it super busy, but you can make it pop if you want to. But that's not going to be something I'm grading on. So if you don't, if you're just new to PowerPoint, don't worry about trying to get fancy with transition timings and animations and all that stuff. Just focus on getting your the material on the presentation like you want it, and keep in mind that rubric that's on the project. You should be able to open that and look at it and see what I'm grading on. um, I have four different categories: content, citation, video presentation, and PowerPoint. So the video and the PowerPoint are two separate categories, but I'm grading on each. The video and the presentation are both part of that final grade. But what I'm also looking at is um, the content. So again, this is not a research paper, but you should approach it like a research paper. Like you're right. Basically, your PowerPoint can almost serve as your paper outline, essentially, if you will, to sort of guide your content and make sure what I'm looking for on these different events. Say, take the JFK assassination, for instance. I'm looking for a um, coherent, organized presentation, video and PowerPoint, but I'm looking for a kind of a coherent, organized narrative that gives me a good background of what happened, when it happened, who was involved, some background maybe around what was going on at the time. Why was Kennedy there in the first place? And these are just examples. If I'm looking at a good presentation, it gives me background on an event: JFK assassination, Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech, Battle of Mogadishu. I'm trying to search through some of the or think through some of the others on the list. But any of the events that are listed or the topics that are listed, you want a good background that that gives the viewer an idea of why am I here, what was going on, and what are you going to be talking about next. So the background leads into the actual event and what happened, um, and then also what was the importance of it. So not just what happened, but maybe why did it happen? Did we catch, did was the person, if it was a shooting, was the person caught? Did they say why something happened? Do we understand, did this have any implications? Just that's I know y'all are all smart enough to a lot of y'all are smarter than me. um, I'm sure. So I'm not going to insult your intelligence by kind of babying you on this, but just if you have a question, or if you need to kind of throw something out and see if you're for going in the right direction, please feel free to email me, and I will be more than happy to kind of give you a sounding board. But that's what I'm looking at for these presentations: is give me a good background, um, a concise what happened. So you're looking at, just like I said, just like a paper, a background, what happened, what impact did it have, does it have, if it's still a lasting impact, and also, I mean, obviously throughout this, if there's any major personalities or major players, individuals that play a key factor. You don't need a dissertation about them, but just make sure the viewer understands, who this person is, why and why they're important to this event. If it's JFK, you know, who was the perpetrator? What why is he? Do we know why he was there? What are some what's maybe one or two things that we know about him? That kind of thing that might bear on the project. So um, I hope that helps. Again, I'm going to take a closer look at the rubric and see if I need to kind of tweak a few things and make it more specific. But with the content, with the one other thing I will mention before I move on is on the PowerPoint. Please, please make sure it's on the it's mentioned on the rubric. That's the fourth category is citation. I do need to see for full points on really full points on content and citation is I need to see a separate citation slide. So at the end of your PowerPoint presentation, make sure to have one last slide that's a works cited uh, slide. And I think I've got on our site what I'm looking for is Chicago Turabian format. And again, that's another thing. If you have a question about that, and I don't know if I can do it on Monday, but what I may do is not what I may do. I'll send out a link on Canvas to one of the a place that I have found very effective. It's a good resource to assist with citations. It's the Purdue OWL OWL. It's an online writing lab, and what they do is they basically give you links. They have the whole site is uh, a basically a how to on using the many different bibliography standards. They break it down so you can click on Chicago Turabian, and then go through and click on different types of sources. So if you're reading from a book, which if you're on campus, I do encourage you to go to the library and look up a book on your subject. Um, if not, online there's examples of on how to cite an online resource, how to cite a book, how to cite newsprint, online and physical, magazine, which would be newsprint, encyclopedias, what have you. Even if you find an interview from somebody, you can find either on the OWL, or you can look up online how to cite an interview from somebody. So it's just a good resource, and I'll go ahead and put that on Canvas. That way you can refer to it. What I'll do is I'll put it in with the in the module with the spring class project, so you can just kind of consult that as you need to. But again, please make sure if you make sure to include that on your PowerPoint presentation. That way, I can kind of get an idea of what sources you used, and I can also kind of if I have a question on your presentation, I can also maybe dig a little bit deeper and look at your sources and say, okay, this is why they said this. So if I have a question or if something's ambiguous, it just it's a good practice to get into. It's not just for me to verify your sources, but it also helps me if I want to know a little bit more that's not on your PowerPoint, then I can look at your sources too. But that's just a good practice to get into for any history class, any class in general, is getting in practice of citing your sources to avoid any possibility of plagiarism. So, um, that's all I'll say on that. Real quick, I'm not going to belabor this too much because I've got. This is not meant to be a class lecture or anything like that. This week we're going over chapters 21 through 23, and I'm going to hit it. I'm going to look at a couple of slides. So if I look distracted, I'm going to the different chapter slides we're looking at. So really where we start in this section is we start in what will become known as the Roaring Twenties. So chapter 21 deals with 1919 through 29, and that leads us, of course, into the Great Depression. Got my goofy mug this morning. So what you'll look at is not just the Roaring Twenties, though. Excuse me. Making sure. Okay, good. I was making sure my mic was on. Uh, the chapter will also look at some of the other things going on that don't necessarily that can get missed when we start talking about prohibition. 19 the 20s are usually where we talk about prohibition, flappers, the Roaring Twenties, on speakeasies and all of this stuff, and that certainly is appropriate, but that wasn't the only thing that was going on. 21 also deals with some of the political undercurrents of the decade, and for instance, talking about the Red Summer of 1919, the rise of communism in uh, in the U.S. Uh, you'll see the American Legion gets formed. Um, in the 20s, we also you'll be introduced to um, several different presidents who do a different who have a different who have differing approaches. But let's see. There's part of prohibition is a search for moral conformity. So talk about the kind of it chronicles the lead up to the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act. What you know what drove it. You'll get it. We'll talk about the temperance movement a little bit. So that's some more stuff that you'll read about. Of course, you'll read about bootleggers, speakeasies, and the rise of the mob. Um, the we all also mentions the chapter also mentions, if you've ever heard of Ponzi scheme. This is where the first. This is where the namesake of that, the granddaddy, the actual Ponzi scheme, comes into play. So you'll read about Ponzi, the Teapot Dome scandal, Harding's. Let's see, and it's all related to prohibition. It's all prohibition related crime, basically. Let's see. We get into the rise of the women's movement, looking at figures like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt, Jeanette Rankin, leading up to, of course, the 19th Amendment, which grants national women's suffrage, because up to this point, different states had, from really going from west to east, had been granting on a state by state basis women female suffrage, women's suffrage, but there was no national suffrage. So that's the 19th Amendment. Let's see, flapper culture, the assembly line that we talked about or we reference Henry Ford and automobiles, the assembly line that we talked about a little bit in chapter 16, 17, I think. Looking at moving moving trends in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. I think that's the Great Migration in the 20s, if I recall. Yeah. Well, so we'll look at. You'll read about population growth in the 20s, which you can kind of contrast in the next chapter to the 30s. Let's see. So Harlem Renaissance in the 20s, you can read about people like Marcus Garvey, the Black Star Line, and the Back to Africa movement. In that vein, so we'll look at that. Conflicts with Jazz Age. We'll start to talk about the Ku Klux Klan, the new Ku Klux Klan. Uh, Rises up in the 20s and dies out somewhat in 25, but this is where we see the Klan move out of the South and start to spread across different parts of the nation as well, and they also expand their target base. So the Klan is no longer just after voter suppression and uh, kind of uh, keeping in check the Reconstruction agenda that helps freed slaves. Now it moves its target to Catholics, Jews, and immigrants as well. So you'll read about that, and they will figure into they never, obviously, since we still have them, they never go away. This is the start of the the Ku Klux Klan that we really are more familiar with today. Is really This is the birth of the second generation Klan. Read a little bit about eugenics, which is not new to the 20th century. Eugenics was actually a study that was popularized in the 1850s and the 40s and 50s, and kind of gets revived a little bit. They mentioned Charles Darwin in the slides, but eugenics is not something that starts in the 1900s. If that helps, it starts, or the study IQ tests and everything that started in the mid 1800s as well. So it's not new, but it's something that rears its head up again in the early 20th century. Look at immigration restriction in 1924. Nativism, targeting new immigrants from South and East Europe. We talked about that in chapter 8, 18, I think. As well, we looked at nativism and kind of the new immigrants, but I may be missing the chapter on that one. But we talked about that, I think, or we looked at that a little bit last week. So this is just looking at some more kind of in depth on the Chinese Restriction Act, exclusion of Asian immigrants, limiting of other immigrants from Europe. We will the ends looking at the Farmers Depression, Mississippi River flood, and the Scopes monkey trial, which is fun to read about. It's interesting to think about what would happen in today, if the Scopes monkey trial was happening today. But involved fundamentalism versus evolutionism, and whether or not evolution should be or could be talked about and taught in school as a science. All right. That is all. That's just kind of a preview of 21. 22 is square in the Depression. 22 takes us from the Roaring Twenties to Black Tuesday and the Depression, crash of the stock market. Looks at why some of the reasons why the stock market crashed and why that it led a depression. Excuse me. Look at the Hoover years. Hoover takes a lot of criticism over his treatment of the depression, but if you look at what he got or what he had to work with when he first came in, I'm not. This is just my personal opinion. I've kind of changed my opinion on Hoover in recent years, but Hoover will take most of the blame or a lot of the blame for the depression, and for not doing enough, when in reality there really wasn't much that he could do to stop it, uh, or to at least or to stop it from happening. Now, whether or not he could have done more after the crash of the stock market, that's up for debate, but that's just, again, my personal opinion. He does do some things that are a little bit that don't make him look the best, that don't cast him in the best light. The using the U.S. Army to disperse the veterans, the Bonus Expeditionary Force in 1932, did not make him look good at all, and did not gain him any public favor. Nor, and if you think about in today's climate, what would it look like if the same thing happened? If a group of veterans gathered to protest something at the White House, and the National Guard is used to move them off, and tensions start to rise. That's really that's what happened, and that would not make the president look good, regardless of who's in power. If it's President Biden, if it was President Trump, if it's someone else, it just is not a good. It's not a good look. So Hoover takes some flack for that. Um, excuse me. So we lead into FDR. Looking at his New Deal program aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. Look at the march of the first 100 days of his his first term, and the advent of the fireside chats, instant or agencies such as the FDIC, the SEC, to that are kind of regulatory and insurance safeguards. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the Indian New Deal, the Indian Reorganization Act. I'm just kind of going slide by slide here, so I'm not lingering on anyone, but this is just, as you're reading, these are some things that you're going to come across. So we'll look at the FDR's so-called Black Cabinet. Some of the criticisms of the New Deal, things that it did not address, such as racial discrimination. Um, but on the flip side of that, Eleanor Roosevelt, who is a powerhouse in the relationship and is deserves the legacy that she has, does support African American issues. So Eleanor Roosevelt will play a very large role in her husband's several different presidential terms. So Eleanor Roosevelt becomes is, I think, really, if you look, if you were to ask, I think she would still be among one of the most beloved and well thought of first ladies in our history, just based because of how involved she was with the public. So you'll see Eleanor Roosevelt's name quite a bit between uh, the 20s and uh, post World War II. We look at the Dust Bowl and the Okie experience, black blizzards, Okies and Arkies. So that's and that those are just two. Those are two different terms for people that are migrating, that are having to leave their homes and go west and east to escape the Dust Bowl. And so the Arkies, Okies are, I believe, what the we're coming from coming to California, and the Arkies, I think, we're going east, but don't quote me on that. But that's so those are the two different. Those are kind of two different terms that you would have heard during the time of people on the road leaving their homes with whatever they have, and going somewhere else for better opportunities for a new life. So the Dust Bowl, there's a map of it on slide 11 of chapter 22 slideshow. The Dust Bowl shows you where the the shows you where it is, and it also shows you the drought, the area that was affected by the drought during this time. So the Dust Bowl is not the only place affected, but the Dust Bowl is just that one section of the country that was hardest hit and that was being affected by these black blizzards. All right. So talk about the Works Progress Administration and the Artist New Deal. Look at some organized labor, Committee for Industrial Organization, uh, factory strikes, the Wagner Act. We also look at the chapter looks at a little bit of some of the opponents of the New Deal, especially after it gets started. Is it doing enough? Is it actually getting the nation out of the depression? Huey P. Long, also known as Kingfisher, his slogan of share our wealth, make every man a king, essentially, is Huey P. Long is a politician out of Louisiana that was a very vocal opponent of FDR's. and the New Deal. Excuse me. All right. So let's see. Anything else? So what we do, 22 takes us into the as Europe starts leading into the what will become World War II, the mid 30s, we were still America's still looking at a continuing depression, and we'll look at this. We'll read about the Social Security Act of 1935. Unemployment compensations and welfare payments. So, just some more actions, some more efforts on the part of FDR to kind of kickstart the American economy, or at least deal with, help those who are being affected by, kind of try to mitigate, if that's the word I'm looking for, mitigate the impacts of the depression that continues even after or 5 years later. Let's see. Sorry, my computer did something weird. Okay. Um, So really, the last slide of the last presentation slide and the end of the chapter will lead into kind of at least touch on some of what is going on outside of the U.S. during this time, because while the U.S. is still dealing with the depression, uh, the rest of the world is watching, and FDR is watching too. Uh, but it's not until really the end, like 1939, that uh, the New Deal gets overshadowed in America, and people start to pay a little bit more attention. They were paying attention, but they start paying more attention um, to what's going on in Europe, because around 38, 38, 39, you start to see larger waves of immigrants, people coming out of places like Germany, Austria, and countries around Germany, Jews specifically, that are leaving Europe and coming to America, or and other various places, that are bringing these stories of things that the Nazi Party is doing, um, and the Germans are doing, that starts to overshadow the New Deal a little bit. We meet Adolf Hitler, and the nation meets Adolf Hitler. Uh, gets a little bit more exposure on him, but 23 deals with that in a little bit more uh, depth. So I'll hit that real quick, and then I will get off because I've been on too long already. Let's see. Oh, dear. So that 23 is a little bit longer, so I'm not going to spend too terribly much time on it. 23 deals with the World War II. So starts off Germany attacking Poland in 1939, the non-intervention policy, and really Britain, France, and the rest of the world looks on as Hitler takes the Rhineland, Alsace-Lorraine, um, and then Poland was really the first military act of Hitler's that was not sanctioned, or not at least allowed by Great Britain and France. Hitler had been gradually moving into and acquiring different areas around Germany. Like I said, the Rhineland, Alsace-Lorraine, um, areas that he said were German peoples. He was reuniting the German speaking peoples in one nation, and the world was none of the major world powers were intervening, but Poland was a hard line that was drawn by England and France. And when Hitler, after promising not to invade Poland, Hitler invades Poland with, I'll mention, a lot of people don't, or this is not commonly, or this is commonly forgotten or neglected, but Hitler and Russia actually, part of the non-aggression pact with Russia was that divided Poland between Russia and Germany. So at the same time that Hitler invades Poland, Russia invades, and they split the country. So I don't want y'all to. That's something that I don't know if the textbook mentions or not, but and I don't think I saw that. But if it doesn't, Russia was involved in that as well. So Hitler's going into Russia is crossing a line that brings Britain and France directly into the war. So by really after Poland, it's Hitler moves fast forward, and he starts moving full steam ahead into France. The veil is up, and everyone knows where he's going. So he moves through Belgium into France, or not through Belgium. He moves to the Ardennes, but he bypasses the Maginot Line, invades France, and by 1940 he's master of Europe. Uh, so we'll look at through the chapter Hitler's consolidation of Western Europe, and then the the resurgence, or the counterattack of the Allies. The When the American and British effort in North Africa, the fact that Hitler fails to capture Britain, which is one of the big what ifs of history, is what if he had actually been able to subdue Britain, but he doesn't. So the fact that he doesn't subdue Britain allows Great Britain to be a staging area for the American invasion. Also mentions and that's not Allied troops. It's sort of Allied Canadian within there too. 338 Allied troops evacuated from Dunkirk. So look at some of the early war efforts by both Britain and Germany, and the Lend-Lease legislation. So this is before, again, this is still before, we don't get into the war until after Pearl Harbor, but we actually don't get into war with Germany until Hitler declares war on America. So that's part of, so really the early part of the chapter. I mean, you see German, it's the Germans and the British and the French. But once the Germans become master of Europe, they're fighting the British, really, until he decides that he it's a good move to attack Russia. That's just my observation. But then we look at Pearl Harbor. And one the chap part of what the chapter does is it shows how the war brings us out of the depression for good. We were already starting to get there gradually, but the war kickstarts, and as that's something that you'll see in a lot of conflicts, not just modern, but typically, especially in modern conflicts. You look at World War I and World War II specifically, those two. You look at how they kickstart an economy and um, breathe life, or breathe more life into an economy that's already there. So that's something else that the chapter looks at. We'll see Nazi Europe in 1941. That's, yeah, Axis occupied. Yeah. Okay. There's a good map on slide 5 that kind of shows you what Western Europe looked like after in 1941, before the Allies start to kind of make a resurgence, and we start to see British and American efforts in North Africa leading up to D-Day 1944. So let's see, we see growing tensions with Japan, Pearl Harbor. So now America is in the war. This is what kickstarts the economy, brings us out of the depression. Japan also attacks the U.S. islands in the Philippines. We actually a lot of people don't know that Japan actually did invade the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, also Guam and Wake Island, and by so really in short order, the Japanese control the Pacific. The Aleutian Islands invasion didn't last long, but there were actually Japanese troops in or close to American borders. But point is by 1940 in 1940 by 1942, early 1942, Japan controls the whole of the Western Pacific. Let's see. We'll look at the selective service system, the draft. Get a picture of Japanese power in the Pacific. Conscientious objectors. Look at women in the military service. WACS, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. The waves, the women accepted for voluntary emergency service. So look at the role that women played, not just in the factories, which is the next slide, actually going from 12 to 13. Rosie the Riveter. So we'll look at kind of the role that we'll see the role women played in both society and in the war effort, the active war effort, and kind of how that affected. We can That's something we can talk about how that affected perception of women in the workforce. Let's see. Fair employment practices. Philip Randolph, the March on Washington. Uh, Chapter examines Japanese internment camps, the internment and the Japanese internment and the camps themselves. Some It's important to mention that some German Americans and Italian Americans were interned as well, not just the Japanese. So that's that's something else that we don't normally see, that we focus on. History tends to focus on the Japanese internment camps, which it should, but they weren't the only ones interned. There were also it was as a result of the powers that are fighting America. Um, the same forces that drove Japanese internment led to some internment of German Americans and Italian Americans as well. And you also see that incidentally in Great Britain as well. German immigrants, and other and German and foreign and German and specifically German immigrants, but the same trends you see in America, you do see uh, on the British front as well. On the British home front, you see some German immigrants and Italians getting uh, getting interned. Not interned, but they more or less put in internment camps like in America. They're just in different locations, so they're imprisoned at least. Right. So Roosevelt's insistence on industrial strength and prosperity. We take a look at wartime production. What By the end of the war, $320 billion have been pumped into the economy, which is again shows how the war ended the Depression. Chapter examines wartime prosperity and rationing. The Warren. So look at Operation Overlord, which is what when we talk about D-Day. D-Day was the kickoff of Operation Overlord, June 6, 1944, which opened a second front. So now Hitler was had been fighting Russia for for a while now, and by this time Hitler is suddenly fighting a two front war. This begins the march to Berlin. Chapter talks about the Holocaust. Let's see. We look at Roosevelt's death, Truman's assumption and leadership, the Hitler's suicide, VE Day, May 8th, 1945, and we see we jump to the war in the Pacific, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Kind of get a sense of how brutal it was on the Japanese front, and then the birth of the atomic era. Manhattan Project, that's the name of the project. The Enola Gay drops Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki 3 days later. And Japan surrenders August 14th. So that's August 6th, 9th, and August 14th of 1945. So that, in a nutshell, is chapter 23. So from chapter 21 through 23, we go from the Roaring Twenties to the Depression to World War II, and at the end of World War II, we are left with a um, we're not back where we started, but we're left in the last half of the 1940s. Kind of consolidates, or we see the rationing stop, and gradually things stabilize a little bit. And by the 1950s, we are a robust uh, economy that's on the boom. And you witness the baby boom, you witness and that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about next week, is getting in the post-war era, the 50s, the Cold War, or the beginnings of the Cold War. So that's something to look forward to. Also, I have it on there. I haven't released it yet, but as I mentioned toward the beginning of the semester, we are going to have a midterm coming up. So the midterm will cover everything from week one through this week. So next week, you should see the. I won't release it at the end of this week like I normally would. I'll release the midterm uh, at the start of the week, and you'll have from Monday through Friday uh, to look at it, to go through it, and submit it. And so by Friday, it's going to lock. So that's important, and just make sure to remember that. And that is going to cover, like I said, weeks 1 through 4. So you won't have anything from next week that'll be on the midterm, but just keep that in mind as you're reading your chapters, to give some time to review weeks 1 through 4, which is chapters 15 through 23. I know it's a lot, but keep that in mind. And then, like, again, if you have any questions on the project, if you have any questions on the material we're covering this week, on what the midterm's going to look like, it'll have directions on there as far as what you should expect on there. But if you have questions, please feel free to email me, and on any of those, and I will get back to you, or Canvas, and I will get back to you shortly. So that if there I do hope that with all this cold weather, that y'all are being safe, that you're enjoying yourselves, and get some rest this weekend. And I will see y'all online on Monday at 8 for those who can attend. Thanks. Signing off.